I'm Sharon Nyree Williams, and I'm all about what's good. Are y'all ready to do the daggone thing? I am so excited right now because I am sitting in Denver in a garage at Teatro, and I'm sitting with my friend Sage Crump, who is an amazing woman who is doing some wonderful things, and I'm going to let her tell you what's happening in her world and what's good.
Thank you, Sharon. I am so excited to be in this garage with you and having this conversation. So I call myself a cultural strategist. And for me, that means I engage art, culture, and creativity to address systemic oppressions. That looks like a lot of different things. I'm a member of Complex Movements. It is a Detroit-based artist collective, and we build multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary performance installations that support local organizing. I'm also the program specialist for LANE, Leveraging a Network for Equity, for the National Performance Network. LANE is a program to address the historic inequities, particularly in funding in our field, and support arts organizations of color and geographically isolated organizations so that they have the access to the resources that they need to be their best selves and to thrive in a system that we know wasn't designed for them to do so. And so what we're trying to do is both engage the structures that exist, meaning push folks to recognize what does it mean to support arts organizations of color and geographically isolated organizations, that there are skill sets that these organizations have that the field needs. And for me, that's about how do we talk about leadership in a different way, right? Not about these best practices and all these kind of historic norms that we know were not created for the communities that we are or that we serve, but how are we pushing against those norms and also building our next system that is based on our cultural values, on wholeness, on our humanity and justice.
Awesome. And let me just say right now, thank you for the work that you do. What inspired you to do this type of work?
That's a good question. I've been sitting with a long time, what does it mean for artists to play a role in justice? And I started out as a producer of hip-hop shows, right? And I would do these sort of connect these performances to different festivals or different organizing pieces in the city, right? And it was like, oh, let's bring some artists together so that they can perform for this organizing thing that's going to happen. And while that was good, it wasn't enough. It doesn't feel like enough to me anymore, right? And so I started to think a lot about what is a deeper engagement. And the more I started thinking about it, the more I realized we got lessons from history about how this used to function. And I started becoming a movement nerd, a friend, and I talk about just like reading about how movements happen and the recognition that because of how capitalism works, particularly around nonprofits, artists, culture, and creativity got disconnected from community. It became something you were giving back to community or that you were like offering back as opposed to always being interconnected. And so I was like, okay, so then what does it mean for an artist to be a part of a prison abolition movement, right? Mm-hmm. And that could be multiple things. And I want to say I love complexity, so this is not either ors. My website is Beyond the Binary. That's what it's called. Mm-hmm. We don't do that. So you have the work that shapes people's hearts and minds, helps people understand a situation differently. And it's also a place of strategy, right? Mm-hmm. Like thinking about the way a theater ensemble builds work is also the same type of values we need if we're going to build intersectional justice movements, mm-hmm. right? So how do we bring these things closer together? And that's the work that inspires me. And I think that a combination of history, my mama, who's always been a community organizer.
Hey, mama.
She's amazing. And my love of the arts and my commitment to thinking about, to building a different world than the one we currently live in, kind of all mashed up together. And it's created this space where I get to imagine with some amazing collaborators. I don't do any of this work by myself or alone. How art and culture really can shift systemic oppression.
That takes me to today in the meeting that we're in. We dissected leadership and equity, and in a good way, to figure out where we all at with those things and how that's impacting our communities and ourselves personally. So I was in this session, and I didn't share this with the group, but I shared it with a smaller group in there. And during this whole session, as soon as the word equity comes up, I find myself cringing or getting angry, except for when I'm talking about it when it's relating to Lane, because I can see and I can feel what's happening there that's changing the way we do things, right? But personally, it irks me from time to time. So what I learned in our discussion about myself was that it's because we're constantly reliving trauma in this work, right? We're living how Black people have been oppressed for so long, and we go to these equity conversations and we have to think about that stuff all over again and then share it with those people, share it with other people. So what are your takes on and your work around equity? What are you hearing from around the field? How are you able to handle working in this field at this time and reliving this trauma over and over again? Because it's not easy work, right? And plus, you're a Black woman doing this work. So how does that fall into place for you?
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important to talk about how these conversations, what these conversations cost, right? Because it's not easy work. It's not easy things to revisit. And it continues to often place the responsibility of these conversations on the people of color in the spaces, right? So we are constantly having to be like, oh, this is what happens. This is how it... It's hard. I've had to build my own well-being practices, one of which I shared on Facebook. I've started singing freedom songs before I leave the house every single morning. I get up in the morning and I do a full-on karaoke, lay it out freedom song before I walk out of my door. And it really, try it, y'all. It's transformative. It really is. Because I needed to remind myself that I'm not simply working against something, but I'm working for something. I'm working towards something, and that I have a history behind me. That I'm not alone. I'm covered front, sides, and back. Right. In the field right now, equity is a conversation that's happening in a lot of places and a lot of different ways. I am excited about how many folks are being intentional about moving past this arc of inclusion, diversity, and now focusing specifically on equity. I love reading. I'm a nerd around movements and our field in particular, and it's funny to see how how many years, like there's the diversity, decade. Then there's the inclusion decade, and now we're in the equity decade. Yes. And like, okay, I'm like, all right, if this is where we are, how far and how fast can we push this, while we got folks' ear and while folks are thinking about it. And so I think part of the work is being in the field and continuing to ground this work, first of all, in history and its historical context. Because sometimes folks like to look left and right and think, oh, we're going to fix this by simply offering more money, or even leadership development, which I think is important, but it's also in and of itself not solely equity. But how are we engaging power? How are we engaging power? How are we showing up in our fullest power? And I think that's a really important key part to equity when we're talking about it, that we are understanding that we didn't just wake up here, and there's a history. And if we look at the history, it can tell us some of the steps that we need to dismantle and what also we want to build moving forward. So when you ask me, like, what am I seeing in the field? I am seeing funders, I'll start there, really starting to look at their own practices. And I think that's really important because so often it is folks looking at organizations and like, how can I help you? Which, hey, no one's mad at that. That's a new question. Yay, help me.
Thank you.
And one of my favorite quotes is by this German motivational speaker whose name I won't call because he's hella problematic in other ways. But he said, when a flower is not thriving, we tend to the soil and not the flower. And so often I think of the organizations as flowers, and folks are like, why isn't this organization thriving? What's wrong with the organization? And I'm like, no. Let's look at the soil, right? And I think we're getting an opportunity to really look at the soil, look at the toxins in the soil, and figure out how to address them.
So for someone like me that's dealing with this thing of I'm in a position of leadership, and there's no getting around the equity conversation, and I need to be at the table, even though sometimes it makes me uncomfortable. What words of encouragement do you have for people like me, and at the same time people that are in the community that they keep hearing this equity word but not necessarily seeing it in the workplace?
So I do think it is absolutely important for you to be at the table. I think we have to engage the structures that exist. And I think it is equally as important to be in spaces where folks are visioning what's next. And that is an important balance. And so my words of encouragement are, first of all, you're not alone, right? Like that, you're not crazy, you're not, make sure you have good ways to take care of yourself, because it's a conversation that isn't going away anytime soon. It's the last 400 years. We're talking about this in reference to the art and culture sector, but one of the things I say often is, the things that are showing up in this field are simply mirroring the larger society, right? So if you're talking about arts organizations of color and their budgets, that mirrors the wealth cap in this country. And so none of this is going away anytime soon, and we need to be prepared for a long journey, but a journey that we do together. And I have friends who are pleasure activists and talk about how do we make justice the most pleasurable thing and the most wonderful feeling thing came from, I'm paraphrasing from Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Marie Brown, and really thinking about how from the work that we're doing, do we find joy? Do we, where is our joy and our excitement in this? And our anger becomes energy. Our righteous, very real and very appropriate anger, also is a part of the energy that we can use to fuel our excitement about what we want to create, and not just what we don't want to see. And so I would say, keep visioning, keep getting excited about what's next. Find your folk, build together, have margaritas. It's my favorite thing to do right now is to wobble for justice. I love it when folks, I'm in movement spaces, they're like, wobble, baby, wobble. It's a great thing, because again, that's mirroring how do we move together with decentralized leadership, right? So we're practicing these things in our bodies that we then use to create the change that we want to see and the transformation in the world, right?
Thank you for helping us transform and being that change agent and taking on this work. So I just finished listening to you. You gave me some great insight. You mentioned your website earlier. What do you have coming up? How do people follow you? Tell me everything. So my Twitter handle is Sage Sense. You can find me there. My Instagram game, which is not that strong, but feel free to follow, is Sage ATL. I'm on Facebook as Sage Crump. My web address is beyondthebinary.space. And I really chose space because I want it to be a place of engagement. So come on in and leave messages and exchange things. Because again, I don't think we get free by ourselves. It's really about how are we collectively thinking about these things and making this web of connection and interconnectedness is our technology.
in these times. So that's where you can find me. Feel free to come on and connect. I love finding my folk and reaching out.
That's awesome. Thank you again. And for all of you out there listening, again, my name is Sharon Nyree Williams. And you know what it is. What's good? And let's keep doing the daggone thing. Deuces.